She is one of the greatest performers who ever lived. She sold more concert tickets than any other solo performer in history. She had legs insured by Lloyd's of London, a voice that filled arenas, and an energy on stage that made people feel they were watching something miraculous. But behind all of that were two marriages, one that almost destroyed her, and one that, after decades of waiting, finally gave her what she had always deserved. The story of how she survived the first one and found the second is one of the most extraordinary personal journeys in music history. This is the story of Tina Turner's two husbands. Anna Mae Bullock. Before she was Tina Turner, she was Anna Mae Bullock, a girl from Nutbush, Tennessee, born on November 26, 1939, into circumstances that the word modest barely covers. Her father, Floyd Bullock, was a sharecropper who oversaw crops on a farm in Haywood County, Tennessee. Her mother, Zelma Curry, worked alongside him. It was the American South in the early 1940s, shaped by the specific grinding weight of poverty, racial segregation, and agricultural labor that offered no path upward and no safety net below. The family lived in a small house on the farm property, part of the broader sharecropping system that defined black rural life in the Mid-South during those decades. Anna Mae and her older sister Aline grew up in a world that asked everything of the people inside it and offered very little in return. When Anna Mae was still a young child, her parents' relationship fell apart. Her mother left first. Then her father left too, each of them moving away from Nutbush to build separate lives, leaving the two girls behind to be raised by their maternal grandmother, Georgie Curry. The abandonment was the foundational wound of Tina Turner's emotional life, a wound she never fully explained away, not in either of her memoirs, not in any of the interviews she gave across a 50-year public career. The fact of having been left by both parents before she was old enough to have done anything that might have explained it. She wrote about it with the directness that characterized everything she said about her life. The facts were what they were, and she carried them. Her grandmother raised her until her own death. After Georgie Curry died, Anna Mae went to live with her mother in St. Louis, Missouri, a move that, whatever its emotional complications, placed her in the center of one of the most musically fertile cities in America. The rhythm and blues clubs of St. Louis's black neighborhoods were alive with sounds that were transforming American music in the mid-1950s, and Anna Mae, who had grown up singing in church in Nutbush, was immediately drawn to all of it. She was in exactly the right city at exactly the right moment. And then she walked into a club one night and heard a band that made everything else go quiet. The man who made her and nearly destroyed her. His name was Isiah Luster Turner Jr., Ike Turner to everyone who knew him, and he was already a significant figure in the world he inhabited when Anna Mae Bullock first encountered him at Club Manhattan in St. Louis around 1957. Ike Turner had a legitimate claim to being one of the architects of rock and roll. His recording, Rocket 88, made with his band, the Kings of Rhythm, in 1951, and credited to Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, is considered by many music historians to be among the earliest recognizable rock and roll records. He was a guitarist, a band leader, a songwriter, and a producer who could hear what a song needed and knew how to extract it from his musicians through a combination of natural talent and relentless pressure. He had been working in music since he was a teenager in Clarksdale, Mississippi. By his mid-20s, he was running a band, producing sessions, and building a career with a focus and a discipline that would eventually consume everyone around him. He was 25 years old when Anna Mae Bullock encountered him. She was 17, still in high school. She had been watching the Kings of Rhythm perform at Club Manhattan before she ever spoke to Ike. going with her older sister Aline to see the band and falling in love with the music from the audience. One night, during a break in the set, someone handed the microphone to Anna May. What came out of her stopped everyone in the room. The particular quality of her voice, the power of it, the range, the way it carried emotion without ever losing control of the sound, was impossible to ignore. Ike Turner recognized immediately what he had heard. He was not sentimental about it. He was commercially minded in the way of someone who had been building his career since his teens and who understood exactly what a voice like that was worth to an act like his. He invited her to join the Kings of Rhythm, and she did, beginning a professional relationship that would gradually and then completely consume every other aspect of her life. The early years of their working relationship were not romantic. Ike was involved with a woman named Lorraine Taylor, with whom he had two sons, Ike Turner Jr., born in 1958, and Michael Turner, born in 1959. Anna May was performing with the band, becoming increasingly central to their sound, and living in the orbit of a man she both admired professionally and was beginning to fear in ways she did not fully understand at the time. The shift from professional to personal happened around 1960. Ike began a relationship with Anna May while he was still with Lorraine Taylor. Tina's own account of how that began emphasized the power imbalance between them. She was living under his roof, dependent on the band for her income and her housing, and in a situation where the line between encouragement and coercion was deliberately kept unclear. She was in no position to refuse what he wanted, and he knew it. She had already given birth to a son, Craig Raymond Turner, born in 1958, fathered by Raymond Hill, the band's saxophonist. Ike eventually adopted Craig. She was an 18-year-old single mother, entirely dependent on Ike's professional infrastructure. In 1960, they recorded their first hit together. A Fool in Love reached the top 5 on the R&B charts. The Ike and Tina Turner Revue was taking shape. In 1960, Ike renamed her. He decided that Anna Mae Bullock should instead be Tina Turner. Tina taken from a character in a Jungle comic book, Turner to match his own name. She accepted this too. The name Anna Mae Bullock was set aside. What stepped into its place was Tina Turner, a persona Ike had designed, and that would grow, through decades of extraordinary work, into one of the most powerful names in music history. It was, from the beginning, a name that belonged partly to him. Their biological son together, Ronnie Turner, was born in October 1960, before the marriage. They married in Tijuana, Mexico, in 1962. Tina wrote in her memoir that she felt she had very little choice in the matter, that Ike had decided they would marry, and that declining was not something she felt she could do. He adopted her son, Craig. She eventually adopted his sons, Ike Jr. and Michael. The household they formed was a complicated mixture of professional obligation, children from multiple relationships, and a private life shaped entirely by what Ike wanted it to be. What followed across the next 16 years was a career of remarkable achievement, conducted alongside a private life of sustained terror. Inside the Revue. The Ike and Tina Turner Revue became one of the most celebrated live acts in American music. They toured constantly, 300 dates a year at certain points, covering the country in buses and vans, playing clubs, ballrooms, theaters, and eventually arenas. It was a grinding, relentless schedule that left almost no space for anything except the road and the stage, and it demanded a level of physical and psychological endurance that most performers would not have sustained for a week, let alone a decade. They opened for the Rolling Stones on their 1969 North American tour, an experience that introduced Tina to white rock audiences who had never encountered her before and who were left genuinely shaken by what they saw. Mick Jagger has said openly that he learned his stage presence from watching Tina. Keith Richards described first seeing her perform as one of the formative shocks of his musical life. The Stones were already one of the biggest acts in the world, and they were watching Tina Turner from the wings every night of that tour. The review's sound was its own category, a combustible mixture of soul, rhythm and blues, gospel, and something harder and more relentless than any of those labels fully captures. Tina's voice was the engine of all of it. She could move from tenderness to fury within a single phrase, could generate physical excitement in a room full of people through the specific quality of how she held a note, could communicate on a register that went past the intellectual and landed somewhere more fundamental. She was, as a live performer, among the greatest of her generation by almost any measure anyone cared to apply. The hits accumulated through the late 1960s and early 1970s. Proud Mary, the Creedence Clearwater Revival song that Ike and Tina transformed into something almost unrecognizable from its original, became their biggest commercial success, reaching number 4 on the pop charts in 1971 and earning them a Grammy Award for Best Rhythm and Blues Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group. Tina's spoken introduction to the song, describing how they always did things nice and easy before going nice and rough, became one of the most famous passages in live performance history, quoted and referenced for decades after. She was on every stage, in every photograph, at the center of every arrangement. She was Ike and Tina. The name was printed on the marquee, recorded on the albums, plastered across the tour buses. And yet she was receiving $25 a week in what Ike called pocket money, while he controlled every other financial arrangement connected to the act. She had signed whatever he put in front of her to sign. She did not fully understand, for years, the extent to which she had signed away the rights to her own name, her own recordings, and her own earning capacity. The legal arrangements surrounding the name Tina Turner were embedded in contracts that would create enormous difficulties when the time came to separate. She described the situation in her memoirs with the matter-of-fact quality that characterized everything she said about Ike. She didn't know what she had agreed to, because she had not been given the information or the freedom to refuse. She trusted the person who had built everything around her, and that trust was not reciprocated. And behind the scenes, behind the tours and the hits and the reviews and the Grammy Awards, the violence was escalating. What she endured. Tina Turner spoke publicly about what happened inside her marriage with Ike Turner in her 1986 autobiography, I, Tina, written with Kurt Loder, and then again in her 2018 memoir, My Love Story. She described it in specific, documented terms, not to seek sympathy, she was clear, but because the truth had been suppressed for too long, and because she believed that telling it might help other people who were living in situations they also couldn't see a way out of. The first incident of physical harm she described came early in their relationship, before the marriage, while she was still navigating the complicated territory of being a young performer entirely dependent on Ike's professional infrastructure. He struck her with a wooden shoe stretcher. She described the shock of it, the incomprehension that preceded the pain, the way she decided in that moment to stay rather than go, because she didn't know what going would look like, or whether she would survive it. The pattern that established itself from that point was one that those who have studied abusive relationships have since described as textbook in its structure, without diminishing the horror of the specific experience. There were periods of relative calm. There were gifts and gestures that followed the worst incidents. There were the professional bonds, the review, the recordings, the tours, that created what felt like a shared purpose and made the idea of leaving feel like dismantling everything she had built. And there was the fear. Consistent, managed, deliberate fear. He broke her jaw. He used her nose as a punching bag, she wrote, so many times that she could taste blood running down her throat when she sang. He threw hot coffee at her, causing burns. He would strike her on the head specifically, she noted, because he played guitar and knew not to damage his hands, which was its own particular revelation about the calculated nature of what he was doing. The physical harm happened before performances, after performances, in hotels, on tour buses, in their home. The review kept moving, and the violence moved with it. And the audiences who screamed at what Tina delivered on stage every night had no idea what she was carrying when she walked off. In her memoirs, she described reaching her lowest point and making a decision that she wrote about plainly in My Love Story. She obtained sleeping pills from a doctor, describing insomnia as the reason. At home, she took all 50 of them at once. She wrote that she was unhappy when she woke up, that she had genuinely wanted not to be alive at that moment. But she survived, and what she described coming out of that darkness with was a belief that she was meant to survive, that there was a reason she was still there. The Buddhist practices she had been introduced to by a friend named Valerie Bishop in the early 1970s became increasingly important to her in the years after that night. She began chanting, a practice connected to Nichiren Buddhism that she found gave her something she had never had in the marriage, a private, interior resource that Ike could not reach or control. She described it as the thing that saved her. July 1976, the night she ran. The final violent incident happened on July 1st, 1976, in a limousine on the way from Dallas/Fort Worth Airport to a Dallas hotel. They had been arguing before they even reached the car. Ike had been in a foul mood for days. On the highway to the hotel, with the city lights coming through the window and the driver in the front seat and the argument escalating past any containment, Ike attacked her in the back of the limousine. She fought back this time, which she had not always done before, and which was itself a measure of how something fundamental had shifted in her. She was done absorbing it. She was not going to pretend this was something she could continue to navigate. She arrived at the Statler Hilton Hotel with a swollen and bleeding face. She was, in her own words, wearing her blood on her clothes. The hotel was where they were supposed to stay for an upcoming performance. Instead of going to the room she was expected to share with Ike, she walked out of the hotel, crossed the highway on foot, and walked into the Ramada Inn across the road. She had 36 cents in her pocket. She had no credit cards. She had no cash beyond those coins. She had no identification of any practical significance. She had the stage name that Ike had given her, and the voice in her body that was, and had always been, entirely her own. The Ramada Inn clerk looked at the woman standing in front of him, bloodied, carrying almost nothing, and gave her a room. She called a friend and business associate named Nate Tabor, who wired her money and began making calls on her behalf. She stayed hidden. The fact that she had finally left did not mean she was immediately safe. Ike had the infrastructure of their entire professional and domestic life. He had resources and connections, and a history of ensuring she understood the consequences of trying to break free. She was careful and afraid, and absolutely certain she was not going back. She filed for divorce later that year, citing irreconcilable differences. The divorce was finalized in March 1978. As part of the settlement, and this part of the story carries its own particular weight, Tina was willing to give up virtually everything that the review had generated: rights to recordings, publishing rights, financial assets, the material accumulation of 16 years. She gave up almost all of it. She kept two things: the name Tina Turner, which Ike had created, but which had, by 1978, become the most commercially valuable thing attached to the partnership, and the right to tell her own story in her own voice. Ike reportedly let her keep the name, partly because he didn't believe she could do anything significant with it without him. That calculation was wrong in a way that would become one of the more satisfying ironies in the history of popular music. She was 38 years old. She had no money. She had a name, and she intended to use it. The long climb back. The years between 1978 and 1984 were the years that very few people in the music industry believed in Tina Turner. She performed wherever she could book herself. Las Vegas lounges, small supper clubs, the kind of venues that were a significant step down from opening for the Rolling Stones. She covered songs from other artists and performed with a backing band she assembled on whatever budget was available. She was starting from well below zero in financial terms. The settlement from the divorce had left her with the name and the right to tell her story, but very little cash. She had debts from the review era that were now her individual obligation. Some of those debts required immediate attention, which meant taking every available booking regardless of venue or fee. She described the Las Vegas lounge circuit with clear eyes and without self-pity in her memoirs. She was playing to small audiences in hotel showrooms. She was, in professional terms, a name that people recognized as belonging to someone who had once been significant. The music industry of the late 1970s and early 1980s was not organized around second chances for middle-aged black women. The people who ran record labels had very specific ideas about what kind of artist got invested in, and Tina Turner, as an independent entity, did not match any of those ideas. She continued the Buddhist practice she had developed in the final years of the marriage. She chanted every morning and every evening. She described it as the method by which she sustained her belief in her own future during the years when almost no external evidence supported that belief. She had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, by people in the industry that her time had passed. She continued to chant and to believe that they were wrong. Roger Davies, an Australian music manager who had worked with Olivia Newton-John and a number of other significant artists, agreed to manage her in 1980. He was the first person in years who looked at Tina Turner and saw not a comeback act, but a star. Not someone who needed to be carefully handled back toward relevance, but someone who was genuinely great and simply needed the right vehicle and the right moment. He told her directly that he believed she could be bigger than she had ever been. He meant it. In 1983, Tina recorded a cover of Al Green's Let's Stay Together that was released in the United Kingdom and became a meaningful hit on British charts and in European markets. The label Capitol Records in the United States paid attention to the European reception. The result was an album called Private Dancer, recorded in the United Kingdom and released in May 1984. The album sold 12 million copies worldwide. What's Love Got to Do with It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the first #1 hit of her solo career. And it did so when Tina Turner was 44 years old. She won 4 Grammy Awards at the February 1985 ceremony, including Record of the Year and Song of the Year. She appeared on the cover of virtually every major music publication in America and Europe simultaneously. The world, in 1984, effectively discovered Tina Turner as a solo artist, and discovered that she was, on her own terms, even better than she had been in any previous form. She was 44 years old. She had spent her 30s starting over from near nothing, playing lounges and touring on thin margins. And she had arrived at the biggest moment of her professional life. The personal life was still largely empty in the way that matters most. She was famous, finally on her own terms, financially secure, and building toward things she had long imagined. And she was alone. The next chapter would begin not in a recording studio or on a stage, but at an airport in Germany. The airport and the man who changed everything. In 1986, Tina Turner arrived at Düsseldorf Airport in Germany on a European promotional tour for her new album. Her European record label, EMI, sent a representative to meet her. His name was Erwin Bach. He was 30 years old, 16 years younger than Tina, who was 46. He was German, quiet, self-possessed, and completely unprepared for what meeting Tina Turner in person was going to do to him. She was equally unprepared for him. She described the first time she saw him at the airport with language that she said surprised her even as she was experiencing it. Something immediate and certain that she had not felt about anyone in quite that way. She noticed him before she knew who he was or why he was there. He was just standing there, she said in her second memoir. And something happened. They did not begin dating immediately. Tina was cautious in ways that her history made entirely reasonable. She was also, at 46, someone who had spent years rebuilding herself specifically to be a person who did not rush into things because they felt overwhelming. She had been in therapy in the comeback years, had done serious internal work, and understood her own patterns well enough to know that the feeling of certainty about someone new required time to be tested rather than simply trusted. They became friends first. She was touring extensively. The Private Dancer album had launched her into a global touring schedule that put her on stage in arenas on multiple continents. Erwin was working. They saw each other when the professional schedules created opportunities, which was not often. Gradually and deliberately, the friendship became something else. Tina wrote about falling in love with Erwin Bach as an experience unlike anything she had previously known. Not the entanglement and dependency of the relationship with Ike, not the professional power dynamic, not the feeling of being managed or assessed or owned. Something she described as mutual and quiet and real. He wanted nothing from her professionally. He had his own career and his own standing. He did not need her to be Tina Turner in order to be himself. He was, she said, the first man who had ever truly seen the woman underneath everything else. Not the star, not the asset, not the name on the tour bus. The woman who had grown up in Nutbush, Tennessee, who had been left by both parents before she was old enough to understand why, who had spent 16 years performing under conditions that almost killed her, and who had crawled out of all of it with 36 cents and a borrowed hotel room and the absolute conviction that she was meant to survive. He saw all of that, and he stayed. They dated for 23 years before they married. The length of that courtship was not indecision. It was Tina making absolutely sure. She had one marriage behind her that had taken nearly everything. She was not going to formalize anything until she was completely, unambiguously certain. They lived together. They built a life together. The marriage, when it came, was simply the legal acknowledgement of something that had been real for 2 decades. Erwin Bach, The Life She Deserved. Erwin Johann Bach was born on January 24, 1956, in Cologne, Germany. He studied at the Cologne Technical University and built a career in the music industry, eventually rising to a senior executive position at EMI Music, the European record label division that had distributed Tina's work in the region during her comeback years. He was accomplished on his own terms. Not a star, not a performer, not someone whose identity was defined by proximity to a famous person. He had his own professional life, his own standing, his own reason to be in any room he walked into. The years of their courtship were documented mostly in their absence from public record, which was itself a statement. Tina Turner, who had spent the entirety of her adult life being visible whether she chose to be or not, now had a private life that was genuinely private. Erwin made that possible, partly by being the kind of person who did not need or seek the spotlight, and partly by creating an environment in which Tina could simply exist without performing. They built a life in Küsnacht, Switzerland, a small, quiet town on the eastern shore of Lake Zurich. Tina had fallen in love with Europe during her comeback years, and specifically with the quality of life she found in Switzerland, where she could walk to the market without being surrounded, where the scale of daily existence was manageable and human, and nothing like the perpetual spectacle of her American public life. She became a Swiss resident in 1994. She renounced her American citizenship in 2013, becoming a Swiss citizen entirely, and said afterward that she felt completely at home there. She and Erwin married on July 21st, 2013, at their home in Küsnacht, on the shores of Lake Zurich. She was 73 years old. He was 57. They had been together for 27 years by the time they formalized what had long been their marriage in every meaningful sense. The ceremony was private, family and close friends, no press, and Tina wore a white gown with a veil that trailed behind her. The photographs that emerged from that day showed a woman who looked, simply and unmistakably, happy. Roger Davies, the manager who had believed in her in 1980, was among those present. He described the event as one of the most joyful days he had witnessed in a life spent in the company of remarkable people. The years in Switzerland and what they meant. The final decade of Tina Turner's life was shaped by both profound difficulty and, within that difficulty, genuine peace. In 2009, she retired from live touring following her Tina 50th anniversary tour, which had broken records for a solo female performer and brought her to audiences in stadiums across multiple continents one final time. She was 69 years old and had been performing professionally for over 50 years. The retirement was not a retreat. It was a completion. She had done everything she had set out to do and more, on her own terms, and she was ready for a different kind of life. In 2012, she had a stroke. She described the recovery process, relearning basic physical functions, the disruption to a body that had been one of her primary instruments for 7 decades. With the same plain-spokenness she brought to everything difficult. It was hard. She did the work. In 2016, she was diagnosed with intestinal cancer. In 2017, her kidney function began failing, a condition her doctors attributed in part to the long-term use of blood pressure medication that had been damaging her kidneys over time without the extent of the harm being recognized early enough. In 2017, Erwin donated one of his kidneys to save her life. The donation was the defining act of the marriage. It was, by any measure, the most complete expression of commitment that one person can make toward another. The literal giving of a part of one's own body to keep someone you love alive. Tina described it in her memoir with words that acknowledged what it meant without diminishing it through sentimentality. He did it because he loved her. He did it because a life without her was something he was not willing to accept as long as there was an alternative. She recovered. They continued their life in Küsnacht. They had the lake, the roses she had planted in the garden, the privacy she had spent decades earning, and the quiet that had always been the most extraordinary luxury available to someone who had spent 50 years being watched. In December 2022, Tina's son, Ronnie, the biological child she had shared with Ike, born in 1960, died from complications of colon cancer at the age of 62. It was the second time she had lost a son. Her eldest, Craig, born in 1958 before the marriage to Ike and carried alongside everything that had followed, had died in July 2018 at the age of 59 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. She had mourned both of them publicly, with a restraint that honored their privacy even in grief. Tina Turner died on May 24th, 2023, at her home in Küsnacht, Switzerland, after a long illness. She was 83 years old. Erwin was beside her. The statement issued by her team was brief and formal. The response from the world was neither brief nor formal. It was the specific, genuine grief of people who had loved someone who had given them something real. What the two marriages were. The two marriages of Tina Turner are, in the end, not just a story about love and suffering. They are a story about what a person can survive, and what a person deserves, and what it sometimes takes to get from one to the other. The first marriage was not a marriage in any sense she had freely chosen. It was a professional arrangement, built on an enormous power imbalance and maintained through fear. She stayed for 16 years not because she didn't know what was happening to her, she knew, but because the practical architecture of her life had been constructed to make leaving seem impossible. She had no money of her own, no legal rights to the name or the recordings, no independent professional existence. She had children woven into the household. She had a body carrying the cumulative damage of sustained harm, and a mind processing the specific distortions that come from living inside a situation where someone with total authority over your circumstances insists that you are the problem. She left with 36 cents and walked across a highway. She built everything that followed from that crossing. The comeback years, the Grammy Awards, the sold-out world tours, the financial independence, the Swiss citizenship, the house by Lake Zurich. All of it came from a woman who had chosen to start over from nothing rather than continue to be destroyed by something. The second marriage was the reward that the first made her capable of receiving. Not because suffering earns love, it doesn't. And Tina Turner's years with Ike were not a necessary precondition for anything good that came after. But because the person Tina became, through the work she did on herself, through the Buddhist practice that gave her an interior life Ike could never reach, through the therapy she pursued in the comeback years, through the 23-year courtship with Erwin that she refused to rush, was a person who knew exactly what she needed and was not willing to settle for anything less. Erwin Bach gave a kidney when she needed one. He gave 23 years of courtship before a wedding ring. He gave privacy and quiet, and the specific gift of being loved for who you actually are, rather than what you represent or what you generate. He gave her a life in Switzerland, with roses in the garden and the lake visible from the window, far from Nutbush and the review and the limousine on the highway to Dallas, far from the 36 cents. Tina Turner spoke, in the final years of her life, about peace. Not the peace of someone who had resolved everything or who had found a way to erase what had happened. The peace of someone who had decided that what had been done to her was not going to define what she became. She had chanted her way through the worst years. She had crawled through the 1970s on credit she didn't have. She had stood on the stage of the 1985 Grammys and accepted 4 awards for work she had made entirely on her own terms. She had fallen in love at an airport in Dusseldorf at 46 years old and had the wisdom to take her time about it. She deserved all of it. She earned all of it, across a life that asked more of her than it had any right to ask, and that she met every single time, with a capacity for survival that most people would never be required to demonstrate. The last photographs taken of her alive are quiet ones. A woman in her 80s, in a comfortable house beside a Swiss lake, in the company of a man who loved her, tending the garden she had planted. She looks, in those photographs, like exactly what she was. Someone who had travelled an extraordinary distance to arrive in a place that was, finally, entirely her own. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.